God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. When we think of his letters written on affairs of the greatest weight, addressed to the first men of position and intellect in Europe, some of them in the graceful and concise Latin of a Cicero or Seneca, others of them in French, that form the precursor and model of the age of Montaigne, so numerous are they that it might have been supposed that he wrote letters and did nothing besides. When we turn to his commentaries, so voluminous, so solid, and so impregnated with the spirituality and fire and fragrance of the divine word, again it would seem as if we had before us the labors of a lifetime. The commentaries of Calvin, says Bungener, mark a revolution in the study of the Bible, and on that account occupy a distinguished place, not only in the history of theology, but in that of the human mind. These immortal productions are above all else that he wrote or did. Calvin, the Calvin that lived and acted on the world of the 16th century, lives and acts on that of the present through these commentaries. When again we think of him in the pulpit, where he appeared, we may say, every day, when we think of him in the consistory, where he was present every week, in the academy, where he often went to address the youth, in the council chamber to which he was frequently summoned to give advice on affairs of state, when we think of his combats with the libertines, whose faction he overthrew, of the hospitalities and attentions to the refugees of all nations, of the foreign churches which devolved upon him the task of their organization, of the hours spent in meditation and prayer, and all accomplished in a feeble and sickly body, we find once more that we have enough of work to fill a lifetime, although it had stood alone, and we stand amazed when we reflect that it was all done in a life which, when closed, did not number 55 years complete. Modern church history presents us with two examples of the very loftiest style of governing. Both soar immensely above the ordinary and vulgar methods of rule. The one presents itself at the meridian of the papacy, the other is seen in the morning of Protestantism. The two stand over against each other, a beacon and lesson to mankind. We refer to Innocent III of Rome and John Calvin of Geneva. Innocent professed to govern the world by methods purely spiritual and on sanctions altogether divine, a man of comprehensive genius, and untiring in his application to business. He wrote letters, promulgated edicts, convoked councils, perfected the doctrine of his church by enacting transubstantiation, and completed his government by the establishment of the Inquisition. In virtue of his machinery, more especially by the terrible sentence of interdict, he made himself the master of all the thrones of Europe. His will was obeyed to the remotest extremities of Christendom. John Calvin held with Innocent that the will of God, as made known in the Scriptures, ought to be the supreme law on earth. But the results that attended this principle as enthroned at Rome were just the opposite of those that flowed from it as established at Geneva and worked by Calvin. Innocent cast down thrones. Calvin imparted stability and dignity to them. Innocent's rule sunk the nations into serfdom. Calvin's raised them to liberty. Innocent scattered the seeds of barbarism. Calvin sowed those of virtue and intelligence. Why this markedly different result from what professed to be the same government? In its foundation, in its maxims, and in its aims. It all lies in this. Innocent shut the word of God to the nations by arrogating to himself the office of its sole infallible interpreter. Calvin threw open the sacred volume by asserting the right of all to read and interpret it for themselves. He showed them, too, the road by which they would arrive at the knowledge of its true meaning, and thus, while Innocent closed, Calvin opened the sluices of divine influence on the world. Or, to express the difference more briefly, Calvin governed by God, Innocent governed as God. Chapter 25. Final Victory and Glory of Geneva. The libertines renew the attack. Social disorders. The spiritual supremacy of the consistory, the key of Calvin's position, cannot be abandoned. Council finally concedes it. Flank attack. The libertines complain of the sermon, of the publications of Calvin, of the refugees. 50 refugees enrolled as citizens. Perrin excites a tumult. Projected massacre of the refugees. Miscarriage of the attempt. Executions. Perrin flees. Victory. Glory of Geneva. While Calvin was counseling monarchs, drafting plans of reform for statesmen, organizing churches, corresponding with theologians in all countries, and laboring to harmonize their views of divine truth, in short, acting as the moral legislator of Christendom, he was the object of unceasing and bitter attack on the part of a faction of the Genevese. They detested his presence in their town, openly insulted him on their streets, and ceaselessly intrigued to drive him from Geneva, the city which he had made famous throughout Europe, and which, the moment that he quitted it, would sink into its original obscurity. We have seen the victory which Calvin, at the peril of his life, won over the libertines in the Cathedral of St. Peter's on Sunday the 3rd of September, 1553. The storm lulled for a little while, but within a few months it was renewed. Those who were guilty of scandals and, of course, were visited with the censures of the Church, repaired to the council and complained of the rigor of the consistory. The ministers were summoned to justify their proceedings, a hard task before magistrates, some of whom were hostile, and almost all of whom were lukewarm in the cause of the spiritual discipline. Might not Calvin, it may be said, have obviated these complaints by separating the church from the state, in the way of distinguishing between citizens and church members, and holding only the latter amenable to the ecclesiastical discipline? This practically was what the reformer was aiming at doing. By excluding the profane from the Lord's Supper, he was separating the church from the world. But he was hampered by two circumstances. First, by the theocratic government existing in Geneva, and which he found there in its rudimental state when he entered it, and secondly, by the libertines, who resented their exclusion from church privileges as an affront and wrong. The libertine faction, scotched but not killed, became bold in proportion as they saw the council was timid. "See," said they, "how we are governed by French edicts and Calvin." One of the opponents said of the consistory that it was more savage than Satan himself, but he hoped soon to tame it. Beza tells us that the revolutionary party made obscene songs on the word of God. Sometimes mock processions passed along the street, singing profane parodies of the hymns of the church. The libertine, says Rosset, commenced the year 1555 with new manifestations of their old wickedness, having supped together, to the number of 10, on the night of the 9th of January. They took each a candle and paraded the streets singing, at the full stretch of their voice, the psalms, interlaced with jeers. One day, as Calvin was returning from preaching in the suburbs of St. Gervais, he was hustled on the bridge of the Rhone by a knot of miscreants who had gathered there. He very quietly rebuked their insolence by the remark that the bridge was wide enough for them all. We find him about this time writing to Bullinger that his position was become almost unbearable. We hear him pouring out his deep sighs and uttering, like Melanchthon, his wish to die. This was much from the strong man. The days had come, foreseen by him, and foretold in his own expressive language to Pharaoh, when he should have to offer his bleeding heart as a sacrifice to God. But though his heart bled, his spirit, ever undaunted, maintained the conflict with patience and fortitude not to be overcome. The reformer returned to Geneva from his banishment on the express promise of the council that the consistory would be supreme in all ecclesiastical causes. Without this provision, Calvin would never again have entered the gates of that city. Not that he wished power for himself. I would rather die 100 times, said he, than appropriate that authority which is the common property of the Church. But unless the sentences of the spiritual court were final, how could order and moral rule be upheld? And without the supremacy of moral law, of what use would his presence in Geneva be to Protestantism? But this essential point was all the more the object of attack by the libertines. Amy Perrin, the personal foe of the reformer, once more led in this second battle. It is to us, said Perrin to his troop, an astonishing thing that a sovereignty should exist within a sovereignty. Good sense seems to us to require that the sovereign authority should be entire, and that all questions and parties should be under the rule of the Signory. Not otherwise can we preserve that liberty which we have so dearly bought. You are reviving the tyranny of the Pope and the prelates, continued Perrin, under this new name of spiritual jurisdiction. No, replied the pastors, who had assembled in the council chamber and were speaking through the mouth of Calvin. No, we only claim obedience to the rule of the Bible, the law of Jesus Christ, the head of the Church. He has given to us the power to bind and loose. In other words, to preach the word and to administer the sacraments. The magistrates have no more right to forbid us the exercise of this power than we have to invade the government and civil jurisdiction. To us, holy things have been committed, and we shall take care that the table of the Lord is not dishonored by the presence at it of the profane. The pastors fortified their position by appealing to the separation between things sacred and things civil that existed under the Old Testament. To the family of Aaron had all things appertaining to worship been assigned. To the house of David had the civil government been committed. It appeared not to the most powerful of the Jewish monarchs to perform the humblest service at the altar. And those kings who, forgetting this distinction, presumed to bring their authority into the temple, were smitten with judgment. So far, said Calvin in his conclusion, is the power of the pastors from being a menace to the liberty of the Republic, that it is its best protection. Liberty without the gospel is but a miserable slavery. His reasoning was not without effect on the magistrates. By a majority of suffrages, the council resolved that its former edict should remain in force. In other words, that the arrangement made with Calvin when he returned to Geneva, namely, that the final decision of all church offenses be with the consistory, should be maintained. Geneva was still secured to the reformer, the basis on which he rested his great work, both in Geneva itself and throughout Christendom. The libertines had not yet been able to overturn. They did not, however, accept of their defeat and desist from the war. Baffled in this front attack, they next assailed the reformer on the flank. "We have too many ministers," said they, raising their voices to a loud pitch. "We have too many ministers and too many sermons." There were only 4 pastors in Geneva, but the libertines thought that they were 4 too many, and although they did not demand their entire suppression as yet, they modestly proposed that they should be reduced to 2. As regarded the churches, they would not lock the doors outright, but they would at once abolish the sermon, in which their vices were branded with a pointedness that lashed with the severity once transferred from the pulpit to the press and the platform. They were willing that a harmless kind of worship should go on. They would permit the people to be taught the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments. This amount of instruction, they thought, might be safely tolerated. As to those floods of exposition poured forth upon them weekday and Sunday, they saw no need for such. It was dangerous, and the council ought to raise legal dikes within which to confine this torrent of pious eloquence. The libertines next turned their attention to the correction of another great abuse, as they deemed it. The liberty of the press found no favor in the eyes of these champions of freedom. What is the use, they asked, of having so many commentaries and printed books? We must fetter the pen of this Calvin, for the state of Geneva is not able to bear the many books he is sending forth. We must stop this plethora of writing and publishing. Such was their estimate of that mighty genius, in the light of which kings and statesmen were glad to walk. We may imagine what would have been the fame of Geneva, and what the state of letters and civilization in Europe in the next century, if the libertines, instead of Calvin, had triumphed in this controversy. There arose yet another cause of complaint and quarrel. The refugees who sought asylum in Geneva were at this time increasing from week to week. Weeded out by the hand of persecution, they were the men of the purest morals, of the richest culture, and the noblest souls which the surrounding countries could boast. Not a few were men of the highest rank and of very large possessions, although in almost every case they arrived penniless. The little state began to inscribe their names on the register of its citizens. The proudest kingdom would have done itself an honor by enrolling such men among its subjects. Not so did Perrin and his faction account it. They are beggars who have come here to eat the bread of the Genevese. So did they speak of those who had forsaken all for the gospel. They are Calvin's allies who flock hither to support him in tyrannizing over the children of the soil. They are usurping the rights of the ancient burgesses and destroying the liberties of the town. They are the enemies of the Republic. And what so likely as that they will purchase their way back into their own country by betraying Geneva to the King of France. These and similar accusations, the ready invention of coarse and malignant natures, were secretly whispered among the populace, and at last openly preferred before the council, against the distinguished men of almost every nationality now assembled in Geneva. Early in the year 1555, the matter came to a head, and we note it more particularly because it brought on the final struggle which overturned the faction of the libertines and left the victory wholly with Calvin. At one sitting the council admitted as many as 50 foreigners, all men of known worth, to the rights of citizenship. Perrin and his followers raised a louder cry than ever. The scum of Europe, the supporters of Calvin's despotism, are possessing themselves of our heritage. These were the epithets by which they chose to designate the new burgesses. These men had not, indeed, been born on the soil of the Republic, but Geneva had no better citizens than they, certainly none more willing to obey her law, or more ready to shed their blood for her liberty if occasion should require. The gospel which they had embraced made the territory of Geneva more their native land than the country they had left. But the libertines understood nothing of all this. They went to the council and complained, but the council would not listen to them. They carried their appeal to the populace, and at this bar that appeal was more successful. On the 16th of May, Perrin returned to the council with a larger number of followers, chiefly fishermen and boatmen, armed with huge double-handled swords. This motley host was dismissed with the same answer as before. The malcontents paraded the streets all day, calling on the citizens to bestir themselves and save the town, which was on the eve of being sacked by the foreigners. The better class of citizens paid no attention to this cry of the wolf, and remained quiet in their homes, but the ranks of the rioters were swelled by numbers of the lower orders, whose patriotism had been stimulated by the free rations of wine and food which were served out to them. On Friday, the 18th of May, the heads of the party met in a tavern with a certain number, says Bonnivard, of brawling companions. The more moderate, who may be presumed to have been also the more sober, were for convoking the council general, but the more violent would hear nothing but the massacre of all the refugees of religion and their supporters. The Sunday following, when the citizens would be all at church, was fixed on for the execution of this horrible plot. The eagerness of the libertines to consummate their crime caused the plot to miscarry. The very next night after their meeting, the fumes of the wine, we may charitably believe, not having as yet exhausted, the mob patriots rushed into the street with arms in their hands to begin their dreadful work. The French, they shouted, are taking the town. Slay all, slay all. But not one of the refugees was to be seen. The Lord, says Calvin, had poured a deep sleep upon them. But the other citizens rushed armed into the street. There was a great uproar, shouts, cries, and clashing of arms. But fortunately, the affray passed without bloodshed. God, says Rouquat, who watches over the affairs of men, and who wished to preserve Geneva, did not permit Perrin to accomplish his design. The council assembled in a few days, and then measures were taken to bring the seditious to punishment and prevent the peace of the city being broken by similar outrages in time to come. 4 heads fell beneath the axe. Perrin's also would have fallen, had he not cared for its safety by timely flight. With him fled all those who felt that they were too deeply compromised to presume on pardon. The rest were banished, and found refuge on the territory of Bern. The issue of this affair determined the future fortunes of Geneva. From being a nest of libertines who would have speedily wasted their own and their city's strength by their immoral principles and their disorderly lives, and who would have plunged Geneva into its former vassalage, riveting more hopelessly than ever its old yoke upon its neck, the small but ancient town was, by this turn of affairs, rescued to become the capital of Protestantism, the metropolis of a moral empire. Here, not in state, like a Roman cardinal, but in the lowliness of a simple pastor, dwelt not the monarch of that empire, for monarch it has not on earth, but the presiding mind, the directing genius of Protestantism. From this center were propagated those energies and influences which, mightier than armies, were rending the shackles from the human soul and calling nations from their tomb. Within its walls the elite of Europe was assembling, and as another and yet another illustrious stranger presented himself at its gates and crossed its threshold, the brilliant intellectual glory of Geneva gathered an additional brightness, and its moral potency waxed stronger day by day. To it all eyes were turned, some in admiration and love, others in hatred and fear. Within it were born those great thoughts which, sent forth in letters, in pamphlets, in great tomes, were as light to roll back the darkness, bolts to discomfit the enemy, and pour confusion on the champions of error. Protestant troops are continually passing out at its gates, girded only with the sword of the Spirit, to assail the strongholds of darkness, and add new provinces to the kingdom of the gospel. As realm after realm is won, there goes forth from this same city a rescript for its organization and government, and that rescript meets an obedience more prompt and hearty than was ever accorded to the edicts sent forth from the proud mistress of the ancient world for the molding of those provinces which her arms had subjugated. What an astonishing phenomena must the sudden rise of this little town have appeared to the men of those times! How portentous to the friends of the old religion! It had not been built up by human hands. It was not defended by human weapons. Yet here it stood, a great lighthouse in the center of Christendom, a mother of churches, a nurse of martyrs, a school of evangelists, an impregnable asylum of the persecuted, a font of civilization, an abode of letters and arts, a great moral tribunal, where the actions of all men were weighed, and in whose inexorably just and righteous awards men heard the voice of a higher tribunal, and were enabled to read by anticipation the final judgment of posterity, and even that of the Great Supreme. This was what Calvin's victory had brought him. He might well deem that it had not been too dearly bought. Truly it was worth all the anxieties and insults he had borne, all the toil and agony he had endured, all the supplications and tears he had poured out to achieve it. 9 years he had been in gaining it. 9 years were to be given him to turn it to account. Chapter 26. Geneva and its influence in Europe. Peace of Geneva. Geneva and Calvin become one. Testimony of Knox and others to the Church of Geneva. The Sundays of Geneva. The Libertines and Berne. Bolsec and Castillio. Calvin's care of the Church of France. Preachers set to it. Labors in organizing churches. Calvin counsels the French Protestants to eschew arms. Martyrs, not soldiers, wanted. Forged letters. Constitution and organization of the French Protestant Church. Amazing growth of Protestantism in France. Calvin had made good his foothold at last. He had fought for this little town as conqueror never fought for mightiest empire, and now it was his town. Geneva had been rescued from the base uses to which the libertines had destined it, and was now consecrated to the noblest of all ends. It was to be, not the headquarters of a philosophy that would have demoralized Christendom, but the temple of a faith that was to regenerate and exalt it. It was to be not the beacon to lure the whirlpool of revolution, but the light that would guide the nations to the haven of stability and glory. The reformer had now peace, but his condition can be justly styled peace only when compared with the tempests of the 9 previous years. Of these he had feelingly and compendiously said that while everywhere the church was agitated, at Geneva it was tossed as the ark on the billows. It was a true description, but the calm had come at last. The ark had found its Ararat, and now within that city, for the possession of which 2 interests had so stoutly contended, the fierce winds had gone down, and the waves had subsided into rest. Calvin now proceeded to make Geneva fit for the grand purposes for which he had destined her. And Geneva willingly surrendered herself to be fashioned as the reformer wished. Her life she permitted to be absorbed into his life, feeling that with him was inseparably bound up her order, her grandeur, nay, her very existence, so far as concerned every good and useful object. Her law, her council, her citizens, all tacitly consented to be parts of the great reformer, the ministries through which he operated on Christendom. We have the testimony of a noble eyewitness to the state of Geneva at this period. In my heart, says Knox, in a letter to his friend, Mr. Locke, I could have wished, yea, and cannot cease to wish, that it might please God to guide and conduct you to this place, where I neither fear nor shame to say is the most perfect school of Christ that was ever in the earth, since the days of the apostles. In other places I confess Christ to be truly preached, but manners and religion to be so sincerely reformed I have not yet seen in any other place besides. Farel bore similar testimony to the flourishing condition of Geneva after its many perils. I was lately at Geneva, he says, and so delighted was I that I could scarce tear myself away. I would rather be last in Geneva than first in any other place. Were I not prevented by the Lord, and by my love for my congregation, nothing would hinder me from ending my days there. Drelincourt expressed the same admiration 100 years later. If there was peace in the days of Calvin within Geneva, there were ambushes all around. The first trouble was created by the banished libertines. Byrne took the part of these exiles in the quarrel, declaring that they had been guilty of no crime, and demanding of the council and citizens of Geneva that they should give satisfaction to those they had expelled, and receive them back. It may be conjectured that there was in all this a little jealousy on the part of the powerful Byrne of the rising glory of Geneva. The little republic replied to this haughty demand by expelling the families of the libertines and forbidding the return of the banished under pain of death. It was now feared that the libertines, supported by Byrne, meditated re-entering Geneva by force of arms. The territory of Byrne bordered with that of Geneva, and the libertines stationed themselves on that part of it which lay nearest the city, and offered daily menaces and petty annoyances. They resorted to the bridge of the Arve, and mocked and jeered at the Genevese who had occasion to pass that way. The citizens, irritated beyond measure, were often on the point of rushing out and punishing these insolences, but the council restrained them. The matter continued in an uneasy and dangerous condition for some time, but a sudden turn in the politics of Europe, which menaced both cities with a common danger, brought in the issued deliverance to Geneva. The Battle of St. Quentin in Normandy was fought about this time. In this fight, the arms of Charles of Spain were victorious over those of Henry II of France. Philibert Emmanuel, Prince of Piedmont, who commanded the Spanish army, was the heir of the titles and rights of his father Charles, Duke of Savoy, but he inherited the titles only. The estates had gone from his house, and were now partly in the hands of the King of France, and partly in possession of Bern and other Swiss cantons. The French king being now humbled, the Prince of Piedmont deemed this a favorable moment for reclaiming his hereditary dominions. He issued an edict to that effect, and immediately thereafter dispatched a body of 8,000 lancers to establish his authority over his former subjects. The alarm was great throughout Switzerland, and more especially in Geneva and Bern. The Bernese had now other things to think of than the quarrel to which the banished libertines had led them. This last matter gradually went to sleep, and thus Geneva, by the shifting in the great European winds, was delivered without the necessity of striking a single blow. The affairs of Bolsec and Castillejo belong to biography rather than to history. Both of these men opposed Calvin on the doctrine of predestination. Both of them interrupted him publicly when preaching at St. Peter's. The council had them seized on the ground of the maintenance of the public peace rather than on the ground of difference of doctrine. The result was that both were banished from Geneva, never to return. This punishment, which had been laid at the door of the reformer, has been denounced as harsh. But we ought to keep in mind that Bolsec and Castillejo were not Genevese. Banished from their native land, they were foreigners who had resided in Geneva, the one a few years and the other only a few months. As to those who are indignant that Bolsec should even have been banished, says Bungener, we know not what to say to them unless that they are completely ignorant how the question stood in regard to the Reformation and to Geneva, especially to Geneva. To wish that she had opened her gates to all the variations and daring flights of religious thought is to wish that the great lever, the Reformation, had without a fulcrum lifted the world. Stationed just outside the French territory, the Reformer was able, from the citadel in which God had placed him, to keep constant watch over the Protestant Church of France during the 9 years he had yet to live. That church was the object of his daily care. He had found her in her cradle, and he nursed her into strength. It was for his counsel she waited when any emergency arose, and it was to his voice and pen that she looked for defense when danger threatened. She revered him as her father. The first necessity of Christendom, in the opinion of Calvin, was the gospel. Accordingly, it was of his chief labors to prepare, in the school of Geneva, qualified preachers who should go forth and sow everywhere the seeds of the kingdom. Many of these missionaries selected France as their field of labor. There they were followed by the instructions and prayers of the great chief from whose feet they had gone forth, and the consciousness that his eye was upon him helped them to make zealous in labor and courageous in death, which so many of them were called to endure in the discharge of their ministry. We have two proofs that great numbers offered themselves to this most inviting but hazardous field. The first is the letter in which the King of France, Charles IX, in January of 1561, sent to Geneva, complaining of the preachers who had come from thence, and calling upon the council to recall them. The second is the letter of Calvin to Bullinger, in the May following, which reveals, incidentally, what a powerful propaganda Geneva had become, and shows us the soldiers of the cross daily setting out from her gates to spread the triumphs of the gospel. It is incredible, writes Calvin, with what ardor our friends devote themselves to the spread of the gospel. As greedily as men before the Pope solicit him for benefices, do they ask for employment in the churches beneath the cross. They besiege my door to obtain a portion of the field to cultivate. Never had monarch courtiers more eager than mine. They dispute about the stations as if the kingdom of Jesus Christ was peaceably established in France. Sometimes I seek to restrain them. I show them the atrocious edict which orders the destruction of every house in which divine service shall have been celebrated. I remind them that in no more than 20 towns the faithful have been massacred by the populace. In those happy days, happy although stakes were blazing, it seemed as if the ancient saying was reversed, that no longer were the laborers few. No wonder that Calvin, for once, breaks into enthusiasm and gives vent to his joy. But we do the Reformer only justice when we say that he rejoiced not because he was leader, but because his soldiers were devoted. They were men worthy of their captain. The success of these evangelists entailed due labors and responsibilities on the Reformer. The churches which they planted had to be organized. These new communities came to Geneva for the principles of their constitution and the model of their government. If Geneva bore the likeness of Calvin, France now began to bear the likeness of Geneva. Thus, the cares of the Reformer were multiplied, and his labors increased as he grew older. He lived 2 lives in one, the life passed in communion with God, and in the study of his word, in his closet, fed and sustained that other life of intense and practical activity which he led before the world. From the contemplation of the laws of the kingdom of Christ, as laid down in the Bible, he rose up to apply these, as he believed, in the arrangement of living churches, and in the scheme of policy which he enjoined on the now powerful Protestant body of France. His counsels on this head expressed a lofty wisdom, which was not appreciated at the time. but the 3 centuries that have since elapsed have set their seal upon it. All his authority and eloquence were put forth to make the Protestants eschew politics, shun the battlefield, and continue to fight their great war with spiritual weapons only. The Reformer foresaw the Church of France a glorious future, if only she should persevere in this path. He had no faith in bloodshed of battle, no, not in victorious battle, but he had unbounded faith in bloodshed at the stake of martyrdom. Give him martyrs, not men at arms, and France was won. Not one letter of Calvin is extant in which he recommends a contrary course. His advice to the Protestants of France was to wait, to have patience, to submit to wrong, to abstain from revenging themselves, and not to be sparing of their blood, for every drop spilt would, he assured them, bring them nearer the goal they wished to reach. Nor were these counsels given to a small and weak party, which by resisting might bring destruction upon itself. They were addressed to a body now approximating in numbers half the population of France. They were given to a body which had in its ranks men of wealth, nobles, and even princes of the blood, a body that could raise soldiers, lead armies, fight battles, and win victories. Well, but, says Calvin, the victories of the battlefield are barren. Those of the martyrs are always fruitful. One of the latter is worth a score of the former. 2 letters have been forged with intent to convict the Reformer of having prompted the violent courses which some fiery spirits among the French Protestants were now beginning to pursue. The pretended original manuscripts are in the archives of the family of d'Alissac, but their spuriousness has been abundantly proved. They are neither in the handwriting of Calvin, nor in that of any of his known secretaries, and they are, moreover, disfigured by gross literary errors, by coarse and violent epithets, and by glaring anachronisms. In the first, M. Dupuy is called general of the religion in Dauphin, and this letter is dated 1547, a period in which the Reformed religion had in Dauphin neither a soldier nor an organized church, and in which M. Dupuy was still a Romanist. In the second letter, dated 1561, the same person is called Governor of Montelimart and High Chamberlain of Navarre, dignities with which he was not invested till long after the death of Calvin. Attempts have also been made to connect the Reformer with the raid of the notorious Baron des Ardrettes. This man signalized his short career as a Protestant by invading the district of Lyon, slaughtering Romanists, sacking churches, making booty of the priestly vestments and the sacred vessels, and appropriating some of the cathedrals for the Protestant worship. Did Calvin account these acquisitions a gain to Protestantism? Better, he said, worship in the open air, in dens of the earth, anywhere, than in edifices so acquired. He wrote to Ardrettes, sharply reproving him, and condemning the outrages by which he had disgraced the holy cause, for the sake of which he professed to have wrought them. A similar judgment did the Reformer pronounce on the conspiracy of Amboise, that ill-omented commencement of political Protestantism in France. Better, said he, writing to the head of that conspiracy, Le Renaud, better we should all perish 100 times than be the cause of exposing the gospel to such a disgrace. But day and night he was intent on marshalling the spiritual host and leading it to the combat. Evangelists, martyrs, churches, these were the 3 arms, to use a military phrase, with which he carried on the war. Of the skill and pains which he devoted to the preparation of the latter weapon, the organization of the churches, we give but one example. For 40 years, the evangelization of France had been going on. There were now small congregations in several of its towns. In May 1559, 11 ministers assembled in Paris and constituted themselves into a national synod. This affair will come before us more fully afterwards. We notice it here as necessary to the complete view of the work of Calvin. His plastic hand it was that communicated to the French Protestants that organization which we see assumed at first by a mere handful of pastors, but which was found to be equally adapted to that mighty church of thousands of congregations which, 10 years thereafter, was seen covering the soil of France. First came a confession of faith. This was the basis on which the church was to stand, the root which was to sustain her life and growth. Next came a scheme of discipline. This was meant to develop and conserve that new life which ought to spring from the doctrines confessed. Morality, in other words, holiness, was in Calvin's opinion the one thing essential in churches. Lastly came a graduated machinery of courts for applying that discipline or government in order to the conservation and development of that morality which the Reformer judged to be the only result of any value. This machinery was as follows. There was first the single congregation, or church of the locality, with its pastor and small staff of associated rulers. This was the foundation. Over the church of a locality were placed churches of the district. Each congregation sent its pastor and an elder to form this court, which was termed the colloquy. Over the colloquy were the churches of the province, termed the conference, and over the conference were the churches of all France, or national synod. This constitution was essentially democratic. The whole body of the people, that is, the members of the church, were the primary depositaries of this power. But its exercise was narrowed at each gradation upwards. It began with the local congregation, which through their pastor and elders decided on all matters appertaining to themselves. Thence it passed to the colloquy, which adjudicated on general questions and on cases of appeal. It proceeded upwards through the provincial conference to the national synod, which was the most select body of all, being constituted of 2 pastors and 2 elders from each province. The national synod passed sentence in the last resort, and from its decision there was of course no appeal. If the basis of this government was broad, being composed of the whole body of the people, it had for its apex the very elite of the clergy and laity. Liberty was secured, but so too were order, vigor, and justice. For the decision of the most important questions, it reserved the highest talents and the most mature wisdom. It combined the advantage of a democracy with those of a monarchy. Its foundations were as wide and popular as the Constitution of England, but counterpoised by the weight and influence of the National Synod, even as the government of England is by the dignity and power of the Crown. Calvin did not carry his narrowing process to the length of a single overseer or bishop. Not that he held it unlawful to place over the church a chief pastor, or that he believed that the Bible condemned the office of bishop itself. He recommended an episcopate to the Church of Poland. He allowed the office of bishop in the Church of England, and he has so expressed himself in his Institutes as to leave the church at liberty on this head. But he thought he could more clearly trace in the New Testament such a distribution of power as that which he had now made, and at all events, this equality of office he deemed much safer at present for the Church of France, for which he foresaw a long period of struggles and martyrdoms. He would not expose that church to sedition by opening to her ministers the path of official or personal aggrandizement. The fewer the dignities and grandeurs with which they were encompassed, the more easy would they find it to mount the scaffold, and it was martyrs, not mitred chiefs, that were destined, he believed, to lead the church to victory. The organization of the Church of France brought with it a new era to Protestantism in that kingdom. From this time forward, its progress was amazingly rapid. Nobles and burgesses, cities and whole provinces pressed forward to join its ranks. Congregations sprang up in the hundreds, and adherents flocked to them in tens of thousands. The entire nation bade fair soon to terminate its divisions and strife in a common profession of the Protestant faith. Such was the spectacle that cheered the last years of Calvin. What a profound thankfulness! We do not say pride, for pride he banished as sinful in connection with such a cause. We must have filled the bosom of the Reformer when he reflected that not only was the little city of Geneva, which he had won for the gospel, in order that through it he might win mightier realms, preserved from overthrow in the midst of hostile powers, but that it had become the center of a spiritual empire whose limits would far exceed and whose duration would long outlast the empire of Charles. I wish to express a special thanks to all the supporters of First Amendment Radio and our mission on true prophecy reformation. If you'd like to support the work here with a special one-time gift, it would be greatly appreciated. We, however, always prefer an ongoing, faithful gift of support for the labor that continues here always. So please consider carefully how much you are able to continue without undue hardship to your own household. In the least, please like and share and subscribe wherever you are receiving this work. Thank you.